So we started talking about surfaces, and as soon as we start using surfaces, there's a big difference that we need to know about as opposed to solids, and it's not too hard to figure out, but you have to think about it. Surfaces are just surfaces. They're not solid elements, and they're not really thick surfaces. Like if we think of a piece of paper, it actually has two sides. It's really a solid. It's real thin solid, but a surface in 3D modeling and in CAD is infinitely thin. It does not have any depth at all, and therefore it is only going to face in one direction, and that direction is the normal direction. So I've opened up the help menus and I've looked up normals just to see maybe if I heard that term and didn't know what it was doing. And you can see here what a normal vector is. It goes back to mathematics. We talked about that in class in a little bit too much detail. This is not a math class, but you need to know that the normal vector actually shows which direction the surface is facing. And if we look down here on the different surfaces, one of the things we're going to talk about here in a minute is the right-hand rule. They don't really say it, but they show you that if this surface is created in a counterclockwise direction, its normal is facing us, or it's facing our viewing perspective. Now you might say, well, why do we care about that? Well, if we render in a lot of different applications, then we don't take advantage or take account of what our normal direction is. We may very well create a surface that's facing away from the camera, even though we don't know that. And when we go to render, it disappears on us, and we have some headaches in trying to deal with that. I've noticed that 3ds Max 2014 has changed what we call backface culling, and has automatically made some of the mental ray materials to be two-sided by default to kind of fix the problem if you don't understand normals, but that's going to create other problems as well. So we're going to learn about normals so that you understand them. So I've created actually a square here. This is not a surface. If I go and look at it conceptually, those are just lines, but I use them so we can trace them and talk about the right-hand rule and what that counterclockwise issue really means. It's hard to keep up with this sometimes because we think in a clockwise fashion in the real world, but in geometry and in Cartesian coordinates and in 3D modeling, we need to think in a counterclockwise as positive fashion. So if I make a 3F, 3D face, and I pick point number 1, point number 2, point number 3, and point number 4 in a clockwise fashion, and then I go and I look at my shaded view, now I have a 3D face, and I'm very confident that that face is actually facing my perspective in the screen, so that if I render it camera from looking from this direction, this face will not drop out. If I render a camera from the back side, it will not show up unless I actually make a two-sided material or go out of my way to do something that will make it show up. So we need to know that it's actually facing the other direction. Now think about this. I actually started at this corner. So what does that mean? This was point 1, this was point 2, this was point 3, this was point 4. So from this direction, it was created in a clockwise fashion, which means that from this direction, its normal is negative, and it's facing the other way. What's very frustrating about Autodesk's platform here is that they give us absolutely no indication that we are not going to see that surface from the other direction. But from here, obviously, I mean, it looks a little bit different because it's just from the other side, but it doesn't matter which direction the normal is. We really can't figure out, unless we know how we drew it, which direction it's facing. So you need to keep track of which way you create your surfaces and your lines and your 3D faces, so you make sure that you know that they're clockwise or counterclockwise when they're facing you. But you don't have to worry too much about it because the new changes that they've made to the defaults in 3ds Max 2014 are an attempt to hide this problem. But I still think, and we'll talk about it in detail in class, you need to know and understand which direction surfaces are facing, especially because there are reasons in Max when you're not going to want to use double-sided materials, and as soon as you go to a single-sided material and you turn backface culling off, you'll lose your surfaces if they're not facing the right direction. So we talked about the fact that this was a 3DF and we made it counterclockwise, but let's make a line. I'm going to make a line now from the left side to, and I'll take ortho off so that I can get to across to the right side of my screen, and I will notice, or I'll show you, that we went from left to right, and when I give that line, let's right click and go to the properties, which is right below your window, and change it to even just a 6 foot tall line or 6 foot thick line, then think about it this way: left to right, point number 1, point number 2. When it gets a thickness or an extrusion, either one, then this is point number 2, that's point number 3, that's point number 4, and therefore we have a counterclockwise surface. So I am confident that it is facing me, and that when I go to render it, and don't use two-sided surfaces, that it's going to face just where I want it to be. Now let's look at that. Let's spin around and think about that. I went from that point to that point, so that was left to right the other way, but from this direction it's right to left, which means point number 1, point number 2, point number 3, point number 4. From this side, it went in a clockwise fashion. Same thing as our 3D face. So it happens naturally for you. You really don't have to worry too much about this. You just need to be aware of what's going on when you're drawing your lines, especially if you make a polyline. Notice I can start left to right, left to right. This one now, notice, is going right to left, but that's okay because it's going to face the other direction. And now I'm going right to left, and I'll close this box, and I'll grab all of these, or if it was a polyline, I can just grab one, and they're all grabbing together, obviously. Go to the Properties menu, and make that thing 5 feet tall. And think about this. Left to right, so counterclockwise, left to right, counterclockwise, right to left, clockwise facing away, right to left, clockwise facing away. So if I'm making a perimeter surface here that's a continuation of a polyline that I'm either going to extrude or give a thickness to, as long as I start it in a left to right fashion, as I work my way through my model, it'll take care of itself. It's kind of a weird way to think about that. It took me a while to convince myself. But just think left to right when you start your lines or your polylines, and think counterclockwise when you do 3D faces. So that's pretty much how you determine your normals, and we'll talk a little bit more about how to actually use that information when you render later on. But I just want you to know the normals are there. Use the right-hand rule and make sure that you make your surfaces to where they constructed in CAD, or CAD sees them as having been constructed in a counterclockwise fashion.